The city of Chicago. God. I don't know how much you know about the city of Chicago, but the city of Chicago is just a real marvel. It's one of the greatest cities in the world. At the end of the 19th century, Chicago was the fastest growing city, not just in the United States, but Chicago was the fastest growing city in the world. It just exploded in growth. It went from 300,000 people in 1870 to 1.7 million by 1900. That's 30 years. It grew by 1.4 million people. It was one of the real marvels with some of the most exciting and most interesting architecture in the United States. Sullivan, the great architect of skyscrapers, came to Chicago and became a significant builder of, I know it says 167, but it's missing $75 of super chats for some reason. For some reason it didn't capture $75 of super chats. No idea why, no idea how it happened. There's there was a gap where it was not capturing them and it didn't go backwards and capture them, which I don't know. Usually it does that. So it's more than 167. So we're just $10 short of the 250. I mean, this is the most exciting city in the world. Skyscrapers, Frank Lloyd Wright, of course, built homes there in the early part of the 20th century. But Louis Sullivan, who was really the father of American architecture, and he arrived right after the Great Chicago Fire in 1871 and helped rebuild the city and build it as a great American city with great skyscrapers, with ingenious designs. And, you know, Sullivan, if you think about the fountainhead, Sullivan, if you think Howard Rourke is somewhat like, what's his name? Frank Lloyd Wright, then Sullivan is like Cameron, right? In 1883, Mark Twain wrote, "It is hopeless for the occasional visitor to try to keep up with Chicago. She outgrows his prophecies faster than he can make them." Chicago is a hub, a railroad hub, a trading hub. It was at the center of the whole agricultural Midwest and a connector between the agricultural Midwest and, of course, the industrial Midwest, the industries in Michigan and in Wisconsin and in Illinois and in Indiana, and connected to the East Coast. It was this massive railroad hub with everything. It is the place in which the futures market was based and the place in which the futures market was invented. You know, it was a place of invention. It was a place of growth. It was a place that defined kind of the American dream and American expectations. And a lot of wealth was created in Chicago, and a lot of businessmen and a lot of families were built around business and about the business of business in Chicago. And yet, Chicago now is a dying city. It's still the third largest city today, but it's the slowest growing major city in the United States. Indeed, Chicago has lost 1 million residents since it peaked to 3.6 million in the 1950s. Its population today, 2.6 or so million, is about where it was in the 1920s. 1920s. So we're talking about a fading city, a city that is being famously corrupt, mismanaged, famously part of the Democratic machine, going back to Mayor Daley and his son and the Democratic machine in Chicago that probably actually stole the election for Kennedy over Nixon in 1960. In every respect, this city is in crisis, best illustrated by its unbelievably crumbling and ineffective, disastrous educational system, that is, its schools. Just give you an example. This is an article in Pirate Wires today, which is about Chicago. There is a school in Chicago called the Frederick Douglass Academy High Schools. That's a great name for a high school. The Frederick Douglass Academy High School. It's in Chicago's West Side, which is a poorer neighborhood. When it was built to hold 900 students. Today it has 35. Most of whom don't even show up to class. Despite this, the school still employs 23 full-time staff members and spends about $68,000 per student annually. I mean, they could send these kids to the best boarding schools. Well, maybe not, but the best high schools in America don't charge $68,000. Maybe the boarding schools do. But that's just an exaggerated illustration of how bad things are. Teachers constantly get raises. Education constantly gets worse. Now, in addition, Chicago today basically is bankrupt. It has massive pension liabilities. It has promised government employees, particularly teachers' unions, higher and higher and higher and higher pensions. And yet, the money that goes into the pension fund has been used repeatedly by the city on regular spending stuff. Chicago holds more pension debt today than all but 7 American states. So the one city, more debt than 43 states in America. 80% of Chicago's property tax levy goes to pensions. And debt service for these pensions is 40% of every dollar spent by the city. Its total budget only grows. So what happened was in COVID kind of bailed out Chicago. They got this massive influx of money as part of their government bailing out everybody, right? They got this huge amount of money. And they spent it. But they didn't cut their spending after they stopped getting money from the federal government. So if in 2019 the federal budget, the city budget was $10.7 billion, in 2024 it's $16.6 billion. And even though, federal aid is gone, they still spend. Of course, Chicago crime is particularly bad. Among major cities, it's one of the worst. And nobody really cares. Reform of the police force has been attempted, but the police force is corrupt. It's corrupt in both sides. They don't enforce the law, but also when they do enforce it, they tend to shoot people up, like the murder of Laquan McDonald's, where black teenagers were shot by 16 times by a police officer. And then the police officer tried to lie about it and cover it up and so on. And now we have multiple agencies, oversight bodies, trying to supervise the police that have basically handcuffed the police and made it impossible for the police to do anything and not improved anything about the police's performance. The number of crimes actually solved in Chicago is minuscule, something like 10%, half of what it was 20 years ago. And of course, the city's corrupt. It's always been corrupt. It's just maybe more overtly so, or maybe it was more overtly in the past, but it's just always been corrupt. And it is run today by a mayor who is from the far left, not kind of the moderate, but the far left, the kind of far left that now San Francisco's kicked out and. So if you think about the far left has completely gone bankrupt in San Francisco. San Francisco has replaced the city council, the mayor, the school board, everybody, and is moving, maybe, one could hope, in a better, more healthy direction. Chicago is stuck with a mayor that is way out there in the left. While not having any money, the mayor, this administration in Chicago has tried to build a migrant camp, but it landed up building it on toxic land. It's hired 4 top staffers who support defund the police or abolish the police. It ousted all 7 members of the Chicago School Board after they refused to issue a $300 million high-interest loan, which is probably the right thing, although I'm sure the school board is pretty corrupt as well. They appointed a 9/11 conspiracy theorist as a new school board president. That sounds suspiciously like Trump. They wanted a taxpayer-funded stadium for the Chicago Bears. Luckily, taxpayers voted that down. And on and on and on it goes. Just, they've learned nothing. They're just doubling up on their leftist insanity and driving the city deeper and deeper and deeper into oblivion. The Chicago Teachers Union, unbelievably corrupt. It has a budget of $30 million, which is funded by teacher dues. Most of that, though, goes into political campaigning. Only 17% of every dollar goes to actual representing teachers, something of value to teachers. During COVID, when they refused to open the schools in Chicago, Chicago Teachers Union president claimed that opening the schools was rooted in sexism, racism, and misogyny. Well, of course, she sent her child to a private school, where that was open, right? Of course, they fought to kill school choice programs, and for thousands of low-income students, and on and on and on it goes. Chicago is the new San Francisco, I guess, with fewer homeless people. But it's in worse physical shape. The difference, I mean, Chicago has a lot of very wealthy people, but most of those people are leaving. San Francisco has maintained most of its wealthy people in spite of the fact that even San Francisco people are leaving. Now, let's see what happens. So this article is pretty positive in the sense that they think that this is all going to collapse. And that out of the collapse, out of the ashes, if you will, a new Chicago will rise. That Chicago is on the verge of, in a sense, a rebellion against the existing administration. That the people of Chicago are fed up. And that, that Chicago will make a comeback. Now, I will keep an eye out in Chicago. I now know who to follow. There's this guy, Austin Berg, B-E-R-G, who has a Twitter channel that kind of keeps up with Chicago. And Chicago's an important place, a beautiful city. I wouldn't go in winter, though. That has resisted failure for a couple of decades now. It should have failed a long time ago. Suddenly, somehow stayed afloat. Maybe it's finally going to collapse, and maybe something will happen that's positive out of that collapse. So we can hope. That would be cool.